up!
Friction. It's a word you don't hear much in modern gaming, and that's for good reason. Friction is the amount of resistance a game puts on a player while they're trying to accomplish the goals of a game. And because gaming has become a multi-billion-dollar industry and invited a huge player base of varying experience levels, developers have generally lowered the amount of friction that players will encounter so as to avoid frustration and burnout. And recently, Dragon's Dogma 2 made quite a splash for itself with its commitment to friction as well. In fact, Friction had at least 5 to 6 articles and several podcasts made about just the term itself in relation to Hideaki Itsuno's much anticipated sequel. By daring to tell the player that they couldn't have it all, Dragon's Dogma 2 made the player savor each victory all the more. But I couldn't help but feel that gaming had seen a much better example of how to implement friction already, and yet that game had never generated quite nearly the same amount of articles or internet buzz outside of its dedicated pockets of internet zealots. I'm of course talking about the seminal surprise hit Kingdom Come: Deliverance, which was released all the way back in 2018 by heretofore unknown Czech developer Warhorse Studios. Kingdom Come: Deliverance resembles a classic Elder Scrolls game in that it's a first-person open-world game with no defined class system, but the game was decidedly more daring the more you dug into its details. Kingdom Come asks you to balance the high-maintenance needs systems of survival games while allowing the choice and interactivity of an old imsim RPG hybrid like Ultima Underworld. But Kingdom Come can also be a janky, bug-riddled trial by tribulation that can feel like it's not worth the trouble sometimes. And I won't lie, I bounced hard off this game back in 2018 and had to cheese my way through several grueling checkpoints to ever break through into the endgame, but I'm so glad that I did. Games like Kingdom Come just don't come around this kingdom very often, and not just because they're hard to play, but because they're hard to make, as evident by all the ambitious but sometimes unwieldy design that accompanies this level of realism. But as well-intentioned as it all is, Kingdom Come's design philosophy also begs the question, how much friction is too much friction? Well, that's a hard question, and one that Kingdom Come has conflicting answers to at times. Ultimately, I think Warhorse manages to justify its risk by nature of its many rewards. So let's get into how and why by hopping astride our faithful mount and riding out in good faith to meet the encroaching hordes of friction inside one of the most profoundly original, creative, ambitious, and sometimes overly ambitious games ever made in Kingdom Come: Deliverance. Okay, so you may be wondering, what even is Kingdom Come: Deliverance really?
What the hell is even that?
How did it become the dark horse that somehow sold 8 million copies and yet it still feels just outside of the mainstream? Well, to put it simply, it's not a game for everybody, and that's exactly why it was so important to make. Kingdom Come: Deliverance is set in a historical fiction version of Bohemia in 1403, and as you can imagine, life is sometimes quite tough and often very seedy in these medieval times.
This is medieval times!
Now, while there's Witcher-style bawdiness and political intrigue, there's no witch here. So it's like The Witcher, but without the witch. So just or as in ER, which is what you'll often wish to be rushed off to when the game has you constantly fighting off hunger, food poisoning, filth, and fatigue in between getting sandblasted by knights. And that's if you're not getting blackout drunk after running in the barn with a couple buxom broads and not knowing where the hell you are.
Where the fuck am I?
You name the medieval vice and Kingdom Come's got you Kingdom Coming over and over again. But to its credit, Kingdom Come isn't just a suffering simulator, and it's often a rather serene experience, with NPCs going about their days doing chores and hobbies, and the game's main character, Henry, often being able to engage in all manner of non-violent ways of problem solving and leveling up skills like drinking, horseback riding, picking flowers, or brewing potions. Writer and director Daniel Vaver believes that most RPGs pad out their lengths with too much combat.
Most of the games have, and RPGs especially, has very compressed world. So basically every 50 meters there's something, like a dungeon, enemies, encounter with some monsters and stuff. We don't. I think it's extremely positive to see that there's enough audience to sell more than 1 million copies with a game that is not entirely focused on action. In my opinion, it totally changes it could totally change. I don't think it will, but it could totally change the approach how to make games, because it proves that there is an audience for something smarter than just action.
Now, this is an important distinction between Warhorse's first game and the industry at large. Vavr had made a name for himself being thrust into directing the first game he ever pitched and wrote in the first Mafia game, and even delivered what I believe to be one of the best game stories ever told in Mafia 2, before moving on from a company culture that lacked the creative freedom that he'd started out with. So he and producer Martin Klima started up Warhorse Studios in 2011 with the idea of making the types of games that were passion projects and unfettered by the industry clutter that Vavr had sought to escape. As PR director Tobias Stoltz-Zwilling put it,
how about we create a realistic game? How about we create a historically accurate game? The point why? Because no one did it before, and there's just a gap in the market.
Unfortunately, as noble as these goals were, much like the realistic mechanics of the game, Warhorse would have to deal with the harsh realities of being a new company without any funding and pitching a game that many publishers didn't think would sell all that well because of its punishing realism elements, its relatively low amount of combat, and lack of magic. It was hard to go against the grain, as Martin Klima puts it. Publishers even strung them along, not saying no, but not saying yes either, and it became more and more unfeasible to keep waiting. Warhorse had to keep working to be ready when the call came, but the longer they went on, the more they were losing funding that they really didn't have in the first place. Fortunately, Vavr had the idea to start a Kickstarter, and they were met with overwhelming support. So with rabid support pre and post-release, Vavr proved the critics wrong. The game didn't need more combat or anything else, and it was actually because of its dedication to realism and mechanical friction that people finally felt like a game cared enough to engage them instead of just letting them be the tyrant of the game world as so many others do. So I've talked up these immersive elements of friction quite a bit, so let's actually get into proving why they're often so good, how they can sometimes go awry, and whether these are worthwhile trade-offs that the rest of the industry should start emulating.
It's time for the next part of our plan. Give the word.
Yes, sir.
So let's start with the conduit for all the friction himself. And no, it's not me, despite what your mom calls me.
Giggity, 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 giggity.
I'm talking Henry of Skalitz.
What's your name, boy? I'm Henry, son of the Skalitz blacksmith.
Henry's an apprentice to his blacksmith father, but despite being rather affable, Henry's an otherwise unremarkable and even a bit lazy party boy when we first meet him. That is, until the invading Hungarian forces called the Cumans come to town, kill his family, steal his father's sword meant for a noble, and lead him on a countryside-spanning chase to avenge his family and retrieve his father's last work. But the going isn't going to be easy because Henry, despite working a trade that requires fortitude, is barely more than a boy, and you the player are as green to the game's mechanics as he is to the Game of Thrones that he's been thrust into. Co-leveling with Henry as he grows into competency during the story is an immersive treat. Like the Elder Scrolls games, the more Henry does something, the better he becomes at that action, all of which is stacked across the stats, combat, and skills trees, all three of which interact in intuitive but distinct ways from most other games. Doing any relevant action will net you XP, but some actions earn more, like actually knocking someone out while in stealth will earn more than just sneaking around, let's say, but everything's worth something. Every second level earns you a perk point a la Fallout, though it seems that you often earn perks related to the specific abilities that you've been working on, as opposed to just simply earning level 7 and that granting you access to just level 7 perks across the board. It's an unusual and interesting system, and one I didn't even realize was happening around me much of the time, but made much more so by the fact that so few of the perks you earn are strict upgrades. Sure, some abilities can give you strictly better energy meters, which depletes less the more you travel around or go without sleep.
But seriously.
Now sure, some abilities can help you just simply have better energy so that it depletes less the more you travel around or go without sleep, but many more have trade-offs to them, like how the manly odor perk will let you sweet-talk women characters more easily, but will make you so stinky that it's 30% harder to perform stealth. Other perks are permanent either-or choices, like how Highborn lets you appeal to the nobles better, but has to be taken instead of the Lowborn perk, which lets you influence peasants. And since the game is rarely cut and dry with how often you'll get use out of an ability, you'll have to make educated guesses on which of the right permanent choices is the one for you. It's a system that's full of inherent risk, as not only is the general effectiveness of an ability hard to gauge, but also how often it will matter. but you can make some educated guesses, like how the general personality types of nobles makes them inherently harder to impress. So maybe it is better to have the highborn perk at your disposal as you deal with difficult, powerful people in some of your most important missions.
I think I know what's troubling the young master. And the feeling's mutual.
All that to say, there's a chance of failure in lasting percussions. What? All that to say, there's a chance of failure in lasting repercussions and even the most familiar feeling RPG tropes in Kingdom Come, and the rabbit hole of friction gets more rewarding the deeper you go. Kingdom Come really starts to stand apart from its competition when its need systems and immersive elements start to tug at you. For starters, Henry isn't relegated to just armor or clothes, as he can wear regular clothes, armor, and even some clothes on top of it as needed. If his armor's bloodied, he can more easily intimidate people because he looks like he can back up what he says. But if you don't bathe in one of the troughs or the bathhouses, and you speak to a noble with dirty clothes, you're less likely to be liked or to pass charisma checks. There are also some intuitive touches late game where stealth missions ask you to wear black clothes so that you can more easily blend into the dark of night. In order to read herbology books and skill books, Henry has to learn to read, and that goes for both Czech and Latin. And this leads to some hilarious moments like this.
Pater noster quies incarnis sanctificator omen tuum.
Are you sure you're saying that right?
Shh! I mustn't be interrupted.
But mostly, as a longtime student of Latin, I really enjoyed hearing the sound check and the settings just being a guy reading the Lord's Prayer in Latin.
Veniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra.
Now, his pronunciation is a little unfamiliar to me, not sounding quite like church or classical Latin specifically, but I am the one that's rusty, so maybe I'm the one who needs to bone up on my Latin skills. Well, if you'll humor me, here's my best shot. Pater noster, quies in celis, sanctificator nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in caelo et in terra, panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimitimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
God be with you.
So that's the cool immersive stuff, but let's get down to the brass tacks, and that is the need system as it's often called, specifically Henry's need to eat and sleep every day.
I could do with a bite to eat.
These two values deplete naturally as the hours pass, and your stomach starts to rumble or your eyes close drowsily on a frequent basis. And if either of the nourishment or energy meters reaches zero for any reason, you will die, and that's game over. So that means that every choice you make can carry grave consequences or set you back a lot of time, as every action is in some way depleting a resource and requiring you to plan ahead to make sure they don't run out at a very inopportune time. But not only are these meters constantly running down, you've got to balance out how you choose to keep them topped off. Rest that restores energy only happens in owned beds, which can often be very far away from where you've traveled, and the journey back may deplete your energy to the point of dying anyway. But let's hope that you've carried some food with you that you can restore your energy with, like meats. But get this, most food items offer different buffs, either to energy, or nourishment, or health, and some even drain your energy or charisma in exchange for a different buff. But most non-alcoholic items are only good for several days and get progressively less nutritious as time goes on. Once they start to lose freshness, eating them will give you food poisoning, which drains health proportionally to how spoiled they were, even killing you eventually if they're spoiled enough. But you also can't overeat all at once in hopes of staving off starvation in the future, as you'll earn a big pighead icon called overstuffed, which slows you down. You can only eat so much at one time, so if you wait too long in the day to eat or eat low nourishment yielding items, you might still be so low nourishment that it's only a couple of hours before you need to eat again, but you're blocked by the game's approximation of your digestive system, and then where will that leave you? At times, the system is quite overbearing, and some food like apples go bad way too quickly. But the friction of these restrictive systems, usually reserved for survival games like Subnautica or The Long Dark, become a surprisingly engaging routine to account for, and sometimes they can generate really fun emergent situations that you'd never see happen were the game not forcing your compliance with its systems. One great emergent gameplay example that can result from this need system is one that I wish I'd been recording when it happened, but it's too good not to share. So it was a dark and stormy night, and I was at sub 20 energy. In order to buy the food that would give me my energy back, the shops had to be open, but since it was night, they'd all closed down for the day. And I didn't have the energy I needed to survive how long I'd have to sleep on the ground to make time pass till the shops opened back up. So I was forced to look around the village for any means of sustenance.
Oh, god damn it, my stomach hurts.
and I made my way to the back stalls of the food market just on a whim just to see if there was anything that could be done about my situation. To my surprise, I found barrels of fruit and vegetables lying out just waiting for me to steal from. I crouched low, and like I said, it was dark and it was rainy, so I thought surely no one could hear me or see me. But apparently, somehow, I'd failed some invisible stealth check. Maybe my rating wasn't high enough or something. And the shop guard came out, caught me in the act, and tried to get me arrested. Knowing that if I ran, I would just end up dying by starvation anyway, I had no other choice but to murder the shop guard and then make off with my stolen food to live to see another day. It was such a darkly tragic comedy of errors, I just had to crack up. But it was an excellent example of how Warhorse's stringent systems asking me to satisfy them had compelled me into an interesting snowball situation where all the systems had a chance to create something unintended yet thoroughly memorable. But aside from just acknowledging more player engagement and risk often means more interesting gameplay outcomes, we should really be lauding Warhorse for making mechanics that don't just feel punitively hard, but which meaningfully realize the challenges of the day. If you've seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, or perhaps read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, you can get a feel for how tough life could be back then. To that end, your health, or in this case your energy and nourishment, are under constant pressure, not just because you're a human, but a human during an age in which debilitating sickness or plague often felt like it was just around the historical corner, cleanliness was a luxury many times, literacy was not a given, and your ability to ascend the social ladder was often capped at your starting social class. I wrote that thinking it would sound less like 2025. Oh God. It could be tough out there, and Kingdom Come's mechanics, while a little exacting, accurately approximate the struggle. But where I'm a little less on Warhorse's side is in regards to the energy and rest requirements, because I'm a little more conflicted on how well this actually encourages interesting gameplay. You can rest anywhere, but the only sleep that replenishes your energy is in a bed, and it has to be one that you've bought for the night at an inn or one the story has set aside for you as an own bed. That meant I was often running back to my castle of Ratai or the nearby mill to get some good sleep, which are notably on one corner of the map away from everything else. The only other way that you have to save your progress is to use these little save your snaps potions, which aren't incredibly rare, but they do cost a little bit and require a bit to make it an alchemy table, at least early on. Point being that even though the game auto-saves in various places after quest steps are completed, they're quite unevenly placed and can't really be relied upon, so you have to be very judicious in how you expend your snaps.
Oh, snap!
This save system also has a bit of friction with the dangers of the fast travel system. Fast travel can occur between any place that you've visited like an Elder Scrolls game, but you don't immediately teleport to that place. You walk along the map like you're moving spaces in a board game, and the farther you go, the more likely you are to bump into randomly generated encounters that have a percentage chance of success either to engage or to pass by. Pass by is obviously preferred as these are often combat encounters against multiple enemies, which is usually a death sentence, but it's much harder to succeed at a fleeing dice roll than to just accept the encounter and hope for the best. The frustrating part for me was not being remotely equipped to deal with multiple marauders for quite some time, if ever, and how even whistling for your horse to help you run away is often a game of chance to hope to click on him before you're killed, or to hope to be able to get on him and actually make some distance between you and your pursuers before the horse kicks you off because it's taking so much damage from the back from these guys. This means that even if you're trying to avoid combat and just do non-violent progress on your quests, you may keep getting railroaded by random events along the way between these quests, kill you, and then set you all the way back to the last save, wasting a lot of time. The solution may just be engaging in yet another point of friction. Just walk there or ride there manually and you won't be guaranteed to run into anything. It may take forever, but you may just wind up there in one piece. It's not the most enticing compromise in terms of gaming fun, but it's perhaps an admirable one to suggest to the player. Deal with all the treacheries head on or hope to avoid them by doing things the hard way. This is one of the few major points of contention that I have with Warhorse's degree of friction, but I think it's only third place to the game's combat and lockpicking.
Christ almighty.
Wonderful.
So let's handle the lockpicking first because combat is a whole thing. Now, to Warhorse's credit, their lockpicking minigame isn't like anything you've seen in, say, an Elder Scrolls or a Fallout game recently. First and foremost, my experience with this game is on a controller because, as you know, I like to play most things on the Xbox Series X whenever I can. Just more comfortable for me, everything works, quote unquote, right out of the box, all that good stuff. But unfortunately, this means that I would encounter the worst version of the lockpicking minigame, or at least so I'm told. Now, what's funny is that there's an easier difficulty lockpicking that you can choose, but it's pretty telling that the only difficulty slider in the entire game is for the lockpicking minigame, so yeah. So the minigame wants me to use one of the joysticks as a bit of a cursor, and once it's in a spot where that little orb is glowing yellow, I have to leave it there and maintain that position while I click and then use another joystick to basically pull the lock across that. But it's hard to keep both the orb in the right spot so that it glows and also move the lock from left to right without losing tension on one or the other and jamming the whole thing up. I maybe got one lock picked before failing 30 times or so and just was like, I'm going to forgo this mechanic entirely. This minigame never clicked with me, no pun intended, but I also don't think it should have been nearly as much of a challenge. That said, you do have some flexibility in how you finish quests, and only the dedicated thieving ones are the ones that, are based solely on your lockpicking skills. So you can often pickpocket a key off someone instead of having to break in yourself, or you can simply solve a quest in whatever other way exists other than lockpicking. So the friction of putting together a really obtuse mechanic that has a high learning curve is one place where I think Warhorse could ratchet down the difficulty a bit, as it's just so easy to fail that it feels like I'm not inside the minigame long enough to really get a feel for it, to learn it. Before the lockpick is broken and I've wasted my resources. But if you thought this minigame had a learning curve, try to get stuck in on that much vaunted, realistic medieval style combat.
So, what are we supposed to do? I mean, we have to be careful that we don't hurt each other, right?
I cannot listen to any of your instructions, for you are my sworn enemy, and are about to meet your demise.
So combat is designed from the ground up to be as arduous and skill intensive as real sword fighting and wearing armor was. Think Mord How or Chivalry, but much less about spectacle and more about timing and precision. I give a lot of respect to Warhorse for this approach, but I can't say that I loved it. But let's get into how it works first. So during melee combat, you auto-target any one enemy at a time and flick between targets. Striking is directionally controlled, and attacking in the opposing angle to your opponent's guard, or uppercutting high guards, tends to land the most blows. There are opportunities for blocks and parries, but these are timing based and only occur as countermeasures based on opponent's behavior, and these aren't repeatable maneuvers that you can just do at any time. Once you start unlocking perks, it'll really open up your possibilities for being a tank, like being able to make your opponents bleed a lot more often, or resisting enemies when they put you in the clinch. There are also some really cool considerations to make about your armor, like how a really highly rated helmet may protect you very well, but may consequently be hard to see out of, so you get this very nice trade-off, friction-centric way of engaging a high-risk, high-reward playthrough.
Oh my god!
On its face, combat looks like it can and should reward the careful player, and while many seem to have figured it out, I very much did not. In fact, I hated the combat.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. It must have been terrible.
But found some really weird workarounds to win the fights that I needed to win. Now don't worry, the following is just my reaction. It's not meant to carry weight as some takedown of Warhorse's design, and once I've voiced my frustrations, I'm turning the floor over to someone who did master the combat, so you'll get to hear both perspectives. Okay, so as for my experience, first and foremost, the controls just feel floppy and unsatisfying. Successful attacks often just sound like two pieces of wood being clanked together, like we're fencing with kendo practice swords or something. Finding a rhythm for how animations play off of each other is also really unintuitive. Now obviously this is a skill issue, just learn it. But my contention is that it's just an unnatural, unrealistic dance to learn in the first place, and it feels like more trouble to learn than it is fun to pull off. Enemies also seem to have very few of the same restrictions that you do, like stamina and speed. Enemies are lightning fast and suffer no fatigue loss in their defenses or attacks, meaning that they can advance crazy fast on you, often faster than you can backpedal, and seem to be able to get right in your face and dance back at will if they don't outright kill you in a flurry of attacks.
Fucker!
Fistfights are hilarious this way, as I was constantly being pulled into a clinch to get kneed in the chest, then thrown back, and only occasionally landing a good punch. Melee combat was much the same, and especially so since the game likes to use this dueling lock-on system to account for often more than one enemy, which is a recipe for disaster. Enemies' unrelenting nature and your inability to heal during combat means it's easy to get overwhelmed and hard to find the rhythm of combat before you're past the point of being able to win the fight anyway.
Fucker!
Combat almost always boiled down to getting surrounded by a bunch of guys and then railed over and over again, the camera being sent reeling as they pounded me, making it very hard to push them off. Sorry, what were we talking about?
Where the fuck am I?
Oh, combat janky and me no likey, etc., etc. I think it's important to note that I never accidentally won a fight or did something unexpected and it was like, oh, I need to do that again. That's how intentional everything has to be and acted in order to win a battle. So combat is really an acquired taste, but the funny workaround that I found is that the one weapon skill that I often hear is the worst is the one that actually carried me to the end, which is bowmanship. So, because I lacked the skill to turn my enemies into a pile of ribbons, I tried to Hawkeye shoddy my opponents into Kingdom Come with my bow skills, and it turns out that it actually kind of works with some major trial and error caveats.
Necessity is the mother of invention.
Because each successful arrow hit often does 80 or more damage even at low bow levels, you actually need to land fewer hits than you would in a sword fight. And because bow strikes stagger pretty well, I managed to cheese myself through some very tough encounters by just DPSing my way through fights I had no business winning if I had just traded blows otherwise. Now, this also meant that I had to retry them quite a few times to get an enemy stuck on something or hope their AI wigged out a bit or was just slightly less aggressive to give me an opening for that one crucial bow shot. But I gotta say, the fact that Warhorse even tuned the combat to allow for the possibility of a very janky but eventually effective combat workaround like this was admirable. I even got stuck for about 6 months where I'd just fire up the 3 combat-centric quests I was stuck on, kind of rotate between them, see if I can make any progress, and I would have to try and cheese my way over and over again, rotating through these 3 quests to see if I can make any progress. But it wasn't until this Ulrich guy's AI magically wigged out one time that I could kill him, and then suddenly the other 2 quests crumpled before my archery might, and I finally got to the endgame. It was really rewarding for my patient determination to break through even in the cheesiest of ways, but it's just a testament to the game allowing me to do that in the first place. So, in my opinion, there's too much friction in the learning curve and pulling off the weird rhythm of combat to be worth it. I just don't think it's fun enough. But again, it's workable or workaroundable, even if it requires a lot more out of you. That said, there are quite a few players who not only figured out the melee combat, but excel at it. And so I employed one of them in Hey Blondie to walk us through how he came to stop worrying and love the medieval broadsword. Take it away, Blondie.
KCD's combat is a compressed sample of the player-protagonist journey. Henry initially can't swing a butter knife across a dinner roll. Learning to fight well requires dedicated training, actual training with a sparring partner, to learn moves, to improve strength, and to reforge Henry and sword as one. I recognise the importance of training early, as Captain Bernard's aggression had me on the back foot. His body language was completely alien, and this confusion followed me into the wider world and inevitably ended in a language I could understand: defeat. Visits to Bernard were frequent and necessary. The feint and perfect block were easy to understand, but learning to time each move required lengthy sparring sessions. Then combos were unlocked, which meant more ring time with my intimidating mentor. The Master Strike, an advanced move, proved to be a whole other beast. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much time I sank into training, I couldn't pull it off. And yet, my weary feet always carried me back to Bernard whenever I visited Rattay. My frustration bled into Henry. I could feel the disgust radiating off him as we left each session, dusty and purple with fresh bruises. The breakthrough finally came while sparring with Bernard. It was an act of benevolence from God. Everything began to click, the compound effect of hours in the ring getting thumped by Bernard, and many hours outside it thrashing enemies. Immediately, Bernard wilted under my precise attacks, staggering around the ring like a Rattay drunk while I relentlessly assailed him. Delicious payback for hours of vexing failure. The student had finally become the master. Cresting that mountain was a trial of bruises, frustration, and stubborn progress, but it's an experience I wouldn't trade for anything. The struggle was organic, as I realized that my lack of understanding was at fault, and not the combat systems or their execution. This discovery completely changed my perspective on KCD's combat. Henry and I dominated fights, and we met new challenges with confidence. It's only in retrospect that I appreciated the skill required to master these systems. Is it realism that makes KCD's combat so rewarding? Sure, to a degree, but mastery boils down to timing, positioning, and reading your opponents, all of which are an ever-shifting puzzle in battle. It isn't the realism so much as the nuanced and mechanically involved systems which make KCD's combat grind gratifying. The player's full attention is mandatory, and the reward for diligent training is immensely tactile fights, a graceful flow to combat, and complete battlefield domination. Few games are this satisfying to master.
Thanks, Blondie. And for those of you out there who want to hear more of him, Blondie reviews a lot of great old and new immersive and survival style games like Stalker and Valheim, so check him out in the link in the description. He's well worth your time. So Blondie brings up one point at the end here that I think is crucial.
It isn't the realism so much as the nuanced and mechanically involved systems which make KCD's combat grind gratifying.
As much as people want to explain away any frustration at the combat as just being how hard it was to fight with heavy armor and swords, this isn't necessarily a very good argument from a game design perspective. Unless fighting is so demonstrably difficult in accurate proportion to any other hard task in the game, like performing alchemy or learning to read, would be from realism put into game form, which they aren't, then it's not even necessarily that likely that hard equals realistic per the developer's intent, unless you just assume that they paid more attention to combat realism, since that's what most players would gravitate towards and expect more from anyway. Realism being important to Warhorse and requiring more out of the player is generally true, or at least defensible, but just like survival horror combat doesn't have to be contrivedly miserable to pull off, or it's suddenly action horror, like you hear a lot of times. We shouldn't assume that being miserable or crazy hard automatically means more realistic and therefore better because more realistic. So the demand of the player's full attention that Blindly speaks of, or the friction it imposes on the player to resist their success, is a more important one. Game design is just that. It's design. It's intent. And it has to be done with ones and zeros, not magic incantation whose output is more than the input. I do find the combat and lockpicking to have more friction than they probably need to in order to be interesting, and I hope the sequel tunes both these aspects slightly more in the player's favor, or at least makes them more readable, so that they're more enticing to learn and master, because right now the incentive is just not there for me personally. But this line of thinking isn't isolated to just combat. The scantiness of save options also feels a bit more hardcore than is interesting, as it doesn't approximate any realism that I can think of. Saving your game is by definition a totally artificial tool to interact with the game world, and it's just there so you're not having to play every game in one sitting. Making it so costly to keep stocked up on save potions, or costly in terms of time lost if you die in between far apart saves, is all about friction by design, but I think it's unnecessary and just hardcore to be hardcore here. The game's already got enough push and pull mechanically, like, me having to steal food and kill a guard just to stay alive till morning. Being able to use a manual quick save, or maybe even just a couple save slots, would greatly reduce the frustration of dealing with all the weird controls, crashes, and game-breaking bugs that do exist. Combat might also be more palatable if the inputs were just less laggy and the hitboxes weren't so freaking wild. I say this because other actions like jumping, mantling, switching weapons, or even just trying to find the sweet spot where a prompt comes up to interact with something all feel less smooth than they should. The controls when doing any type of minor platforming are also an exercise in insanity. For instance, one mission has you scouting around Skalitz on a return trip to bury your parents. There's a clear shot up the main street to get to your objective, but you soon find out that soldiers are patrolling here and will kill you pretty easily along this main road. So you're incentivized to go to the left and up and over a fence and down a back way that skirts the left edge and indirectly leads you to your destination with less resistance. But the mere act of taking this very obvious stealth approach is compounded tenfold by how floppy the jump animation is in terms of height and controllability, and how often you get stuck at the slightest obstruction because everything's hitboxes are way bigger than they spatially should be. The amount of times that I die or get stuck trying to pull off something the game was encouraging me to do here was just silly when the controls weren't up to the task, and the save options so limited that I was often being punished for doing what the game was allowing for, but with the noted huge downside of having to be very judicious with my choices if I didn't have enough save items or whatnot. There are just points where the friction can build up to the point of feeling like I'm burning up in the friction of entering the atmosphere, let's say, instead of breaking through triumphantly into the clear sky of victory. There are also instances of signposting where objectives feel unfriendly in their vagueness. Quite a few quests just set you free to solve nebulous objectives and provide almost no guidance as to where to begin either in the map or in the quest log. One of the quests I got stuck on for months involves seeking out a mine gallery, but the marker takes you to the above ground hole where you look down into the mine, but you're supposed to be way down underground in the mine to actually fulfill the quest objective. No indication is given to you where this mine shaft entry point actually is though, because you can't get through this hole, and it was only through YouTube walkthroughs that I found out where this was, only to get stuck down there too as I had to fight past tons of guards in the dark and hope to get lucky as they bombarded me with melee as I feebly strung my bow together and hoped to not miss. Fun stuff! There are also quite a few quests that highlight a huge area of countryside and then just set you loose and go, good luck, go find the thing. This vagueness would be more interesting if there were more visible landmarks or intuitive landscaping that might betray functionality or, where a certain thing might be relative to this thing. But usually I just kind of had to wander around in hopes that I run into my objective eventually or just look it up because I had better things to do than just wander the countryside very slowly, draining all my resources. Let's also not forget that Kingdom Come Deliverance is one of the buggiest modern games that you're probably ever going to play. Now, I experienced far fewer than most did, but just looking at the forums to see the cavalcade of broken quests and AI behaviors that are out there, and let's just say I was impressed. Now, for my part, I only saw little weird ones like this Woman's Lot DLC one, where you play Teresa. There's a quest up where you kill a stray dog, but doesn't make the quest giver show up where she says she's going to be once you've done that task. Viper's Nest mission is also quite messed up, as the sultry AI bunches up in hilarious ways quite often and locks you in the tent. I also had several crashes, which hit me pretty hard in a game with various limited save options already. Honestly, Xbox Series X's quick resume feature, letting me keep a game on standby for the night instead of having to waste save items just to stop playing, is a godsend. In another quest, where I had to find a counterfeiting workshop, my helper Ulrich would just disappear sometimes and then wouldn't help me fight them. Then the quest would just stick me in a corner and wouldn't let me move, so I just died. Again, as much jank exists in all the control systems and how messy the code can be, it's hard not to feel justified when critiquing certain aspects of this game as being more about incompetence than masterful friction meant to tease out responses from the players. Okay, so I understand that that's quite a wall of negative criticism to levy at Kingdom Come's design, but let's gradually make our way back to the real takeaways from the game, and that is the outrageous amount of interesting and immersive gameplay experiences on offer here that take proper advantage of Warhorse's commitment to realism and its accompanying friction. Few better examples exist of the glories of Kingdom Come than the quest line set in the monastery. It feels almost like a whole DLC unto itself at times, and is an excellent microcosm of how Kingdom Come manages to entertain in creative ways, even if its ambitious design breaks down a lot and becomes a little frustrating. Okay, so minor spoilers, but at one point in the main quest, you're tasked with finding a killer who's associated with the humans who murdered your parents. The twist is that he's supposedly retired to a monastery in Sasel and is hiding out there as one of the monks. So it's your job to infiltrate the monastery, pose as a monk, and try to find out what to do about this killer. So you're initiated into the monastery in one of the funniest scenes in the game that nearly gives Henry away because he's so clueless.
Suscipe me Domine secundum
Eloquium tum et vivam.
In loquium tuum vivam et non confundas me ab expectatione me.
Once you're inducted into the order, Henry, or Brother Gregor as he's called here, then has to follow the rigid schedule of monastic life, including daily and evening prayer and chores of all varieties. If you're caught out in the halls, not where you're supposed to be according to your schedule, you've got 3 strikes before you're put into solitary confinement and the day resets, meaning you have to trudge through the tedium of all your obligations again and hope to make it to the night hours where you have allotted free time so that you can pursue any leads about the identity of the killer, as well as doing any other clandestine activities like finding a secret drinking game in the basement or spying on another member of the order so that one brother can become the new abbot. In the case of the drinking game, you can actually get in good with the Circaders, who are basically the monastery police, and they'll give you a free pass the next time they catch you out in the halls. But while my knowledge of church liturgy actually helped me to know what to do first on the schedule, go to matins or morning prayer, beyond that, I had to look at my schedule to keep in compliance, and let me tell you, it's not easy. You're often told to be in the library doing work for a brother for several hours, but if you finish early, your only options are to just kind of stand in place and wait it out, or you can rest and advance the time. But unfortunately, since you can only rest in increments of hours, this can often mean that if you're ever at, say, 12:15 and you rest an hour and you're supposed to be somewhere at 1, it's now 1:15 and you're now out of schedule. So it can mean you could get caught or be in danger of getting caught as you rush to your next thing and hope not to be seen. Unfortunately, the game's scripting often gets confused, even just about accurately telling you where you're supposed to be, and it punishes you even if you're in the right place at the right time. There's just a lot of variables working against a rather well thought out quest, even if you're following the rules. There's also the issue of the Circaders sometimes incorrectly punishing you with solitary and the day resetting after just your first offense, not your third. One conversation went haywire when a Circator accused me of being outside my routine despite being where I was supposed to be. I tried to use my hall pass to get out of jail free once because, we were drinking buddies, and he said yes, but then the conversation just reset as if there was any other Circator encounter. Then he told me that I was getting imprisoned. All this for a first offense that I just cashed in an immunity for anyway. The scripting can get really wild. Even more bristling, if you happen to tell an impressionable and paranoid young monk named Lucas why you're here in hopes that he'll aid your investigation, he'll actually rat you out to the abbot and get you kicked out, messing up all the conversations and work that you've put into your investigation so far. I found this outcome rather annoying in that there's no way to forecast this outcome and no counterplay to it once you've said too much, but it is a brave choice for Warhorse. You can still complete the quest, mind you, but just in a much less interesting way. But the quest itself, when it's working according to its own rules, is a masterclass of immersion. I couldn't do all the things and frame a guy and let the killer go, unfortunately. In fact, I got kicked out right after Lucas ratted me out and had to sneak back in and just murder the killer outright, but being very careful to do so when I knew the monks were sleeping and he'd be the easiest target, which is up until about 3 or 4 in the morning. Just having to consider small details like that is what makes Kingdom Come pretty special. Even when it's crashing down around itself, the details are still what matters, and the scope of their creativity to allow for banal solutions if the cool ones break, like in the case of this quest, or how I could eventually cheese the combat using what is often called the worst weapon in the bow, is just a testament to how much depth of design can safekeep a player's experience against, jank, and just things kind of going bad for you. Another great example of this is the Father Godwin quest. Father Godwin's an absolute hedonist, a drunkard and a fornicator, and he gets Henry to indulge in some drunken writing that leaves him utterly worthless to deliver mass the next morning, meaning it's somehow up to Henry's unchurched ass to deliver the sermon.
Where the fuck am I?
So, Henry, you may begin.
Now I'm curious which one of them will puke first.
The worse it goes, the funnier it gets.
I say to you, in the words of Jan Hus, he who knows much, let him speak much. Let each speak as much as he knows.
That's his conclusion.
Utterly blasphemous.
Can you believe such behavior? For men of the cloth to get drunk at...
I failed miserably, made his whole congregation leave, and lost out on him helping me as a result, and I could no longer get the quest done in an efficient manner, but gosh, it was worth it. Friction, well managed, I'd say. Now, the final example I'll leave you with is Daniel Vavra's favorite player story. So this player snuck into a camp and dropped a sleeping potion into their food cauldron, and by the morning, the AI soldiers at the camp had eaten the breakfast, per their realistic routine, and they all fell asleep. He took off all their armor and weapons by looting their unconscious bodies, then killed them all as they awoke, bewildered and defenseless from the effects of the sleeping potion. As Vavra says,
it's kind of sociopathic behavior.
But it just shows you the depth that you could basically circumvent an entire quest worth of battles and, open conflict by just drugging these guys and knocking them out imsim style, doing intuitive cascading things that feel grand, but are really just the sum total of well-planned AI behaviors and coding. As Vavra says, and this is what imsim designers always love to hear,
there are people who are doing stuff that I didn't even imagine.
And that's ultimately why Kingdom Come succeeds. It's built in the same way that immersive sims often are, and it manages to cover its own bases either by design or by happy accident. Yes, it's easy to love the world for its natural beauty, even for its somewhat cat fidelity on a 2018 console. It's got one of the best soundtracks you'll ever hear, and it captures that wonderful feeling that games like Oblivion did when you're just riding along the countryside to the folksy swell of stringed instruments. And yes, Kingdom Come is easily one of the funniest and most original RPGs you're likely to play. It's a sumptuous achievement because of all these aspects, but mostly because of the playstyle freedom it allows for and how much it rewards you for engaging even the most stringent and tough parts of its design.
I don't understand. Why?
I was awful at combat and lockpicking, and yet I could complete the main quest and did quite a few side quests by either exploiting various things, kiting dudes and shooting them with arrows, or just plain using speech checks whenever I could instead of fighting, or using an alternative method to lockpicking like pickpocketing a guy's keys or just doing some other variation of quest completion. And I can't overlook how cool some of the emergent things that can happen are when all these systems are converging in interesting ways. But of course, it's most impressive that Kingdom Come dares to immerse you in friction-heavy mechanics that bring to life the harshness of the time period, instead of just arbitrarily setting out to make a hard game. Your leveling up feels as natural as growing old, as Henry's place in the story mirrors your own competencies growing in-game. But leveling up isn't just a strict descent. It's full of perks that can only be chosen one over the other permanently, or which often have trade-offs, and they often require careful consideration before committing to for the rest of your playthrough. You have to learn how to read before you can upgrade yourself or learn how to make some very important potions. You need to be clean or you'll lose charisma points, and you have to make sure you eat and sleep regularly or you'll straight up die.
Oh my god!
Just die!
Saving is limited to consumables and beds strewn out all over the world, and it may take up too much energy getting back to them to reset your attributes for the next day. Combat's quite tough to learn too, and hard to master. It's got a very peculiar rhythm of its own, and lockpicking, especially on console, will really test your skills and your patience. So that's not to say that all friction here is interesting or realistic. Some quest markers seem broken or just unnecessary and misleading. There are tons of quest-breaking bugs and weird glitches, and the controls are just frankly janky no matter what you're doing. So to assume that friction or realism or difficulty that the game puts you under is all by design is naive. But still, Warhorse has dedicated so much effort into authentically recreating the yesteryears of their culture with so much creativity and humor and emergent gameplay that you're often able to withstand the onslaught of all the jank. And that's just the mark of a great game, even if players have to get used to its overbearing flaws, much like Henry does the many licentious priests that he encounters. Mostly, I'm just glad that grand experiments like Kingdom Come Deliverance exist and are still trying to be made. They give us hope that ambition doesn't just have to be for more money, like so much AAA development is after, but about achievement in the arts, even if it means that some things break along the way.
Those are things worth living for.
That said, I do hope the forthcoming sequel makes the controls for the lockpicking and the combat a little easier to comprehend and pull off for boobs like me, but I also don't want Warhorse to get cold feet and overly water down the mechanics so much that they feel like any other game, or that they don't resist the player's whims at all. The friction of Kingdom Come Deliverance is a double-edged sword, no doubt, but I hope the sequel doesn't make the series lose its edge. For the sake of science, I just hope the grand experiment keeps going.
Yes, science!
Fortunately, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is already getting rave previews. The release date was pushed up a week, and review copies were sent out a month in advance of this release date, so Warhorse seems pretty confident. Not only that, but Warhorse is sending out free copies of the game to those who supported the first game on Kickstarter, which is a nearly decade-old promise that they're making good on. When do any of these three things ever happen? So, those seem like pretty good signs. Therefore, the sequel will be the first game that I buy brand new since Alone in the Dark and Dragon's Dogma 2 back in March of 2024, and that's the DLC and all. That's how special this game feels likely to be, and how special this type of game is in the current landscape. Now, despite what all these chuds say is happening, gaming isn't dying, although certainly it often needs to be reborn or tempered with fire. But some people carry the torch for games that they feel like are being made to be enjoyed, and not just to assassinate minutes of your life so that you're not bored. As Martin Klima says,
a good game will never be designed by a committee. You really need one strong-willed person that's not willing to put up with less than perfection.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So thank God for Warhorse, and Jesus Christ be praised.
Jesus Christ be praised.
Jesus Christ be praised.
Jesus Christ be praised. That's what they all say. But seriously.
Before I go, I'd like to give a huge shout out to those of you generous enough to support my work by becoming a patron. Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Hey Blondie, Hey Aksho, M, Bibby F. and Bloxburg, and Melancholy Geek. And an extra special thank you to those of you donating at my highest paid tiers, The Nth Review and James Wyatt. Now, if you'd like to keep what few lights I have on, you should join these folks at patreon.com/Midnight Medium, or become a YouTube channel member, or buy me a coffee and donate at PayPal. Also, check out my GOG and NordVPN affiliate links to support me with no extra cost to you. And if you aren't tired of me yet, check me out as I join Deadforge and Robert Yap in the Quad Damage podcast, where we talk first-person shooters with developers and content creators alike. God bless you, everyone, and I'll see you soon.